Welcome everyone to the webinar today, organized by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center at the University of Sydney. We acknowledge the tradition and custodianship and law of the country on which the University of Sydney campuses stand. We pay our respects to those who have care and continue to care for country. Today, we're going to be presenting you with an excellent panel of expert speakers to discuss the results and the implications of the 2022 Philippine presidential election, which just recently took place. The May 2022 presidential election in the Philippines was a landslide victory for Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., the son of late Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. While his promise of unity brought hope to millions of his supporters, many critics worried the country could descend into autocracy if Bongbong follows in his father's footsteps and brings the Philippines under martial law. This roundtable will discuss the election results as well as the implications going forward for the Philippines. And we're joined today by Dr. Sandra Seno-Alday from the Sydney Business School, and Professor Aries Arugay from the University of Philippines Diliman, Mr. Rado Gatchalian, who is the leader of Australian for BBM-Sara group, but also a leader of a number of the Philippines community initiatives based here in Sydney, and Mr. Primitivo Ragandang, who is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University. Thank you for having us. We're going to start as a roundtable. I'm going to be asking. I'm Sinpeng from University of Sydney. I'm going to be your moderator today. So I'll be starting with a few questions directed at the speakers individually, and then I'll have a few more questions that are directed as a group. So Aries, I'll start with you. You witnessed firsthand the lead up to the election, what was different about this election campaign when compared to when Duterte ran for election?
Thank you, Aim. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to join this fantastic panel, and I'm grateful to the Sydney Southeast Asia Center for inviting me. Aim, I can distinctly remember you also moderated a roundtable in the 2016 election 6 years ago, but actually in Sydney, and I was there to answer a similar question. But I'll go straight ahead because we have a lot of ground to cover. I do think that the 2022 elections was more polarizing in the sense that while there were more presidential candidates, it was obvious that there was a front runner in the beginning, and that is President Marcos Jr. However, even though that he was already polling way ahead of his other opponents, there was a contender, and that is the main opposition candidate back then, the incumbent Vice President Leni Robredo. Unlike in 2016, wherein it was considered more as a four-cornered fight, the 2022 elections was a polarizing contest between Marcos Jr. and Leni Robredo. So much so because Marcos was successfully able to strike an alliance with then the incumbent administration of President Duterte, mainly through his daughter, Sara Duterte. The second, I think, difference has something to do with, and you're familiar with this more than anyone, is the more prominent role social media has played, not only in providing electoral information, but also in mobilizing the Filipino electorate in various ways, and for me, contributing to further polarization of the electoral arena. Social media itself has, I would say, has become full-fledged with more social media platforms being used by candidates. Back then, we were just focused, remember our study, we were just focused on Facebook, but this time around, there were many other platforms. There were many more Filipinos who use social media as a source of their information, together with the perceived decline or lack of trust on the legitimacy of mainstream media as well as other platforms. And I think finally, the big difference is that this election somehow has become somewhat a referendum on Philippine democracy in general, in the way that how Philippine democracy has performed since the martial law era ended or the dictatorship ended in 1986, and what kind of democracy Filipinos want in the coming years. So I think those three are the main things, and I'm sure the other panelists will also give their own opinions about the elections, and I look forward to that conversation.
Prime, you were actually in Mindanao in the lead up to the election and on the election day itself. What was it like to observe the election and the campaigning from that part of the Philippines? And, you know, what can you tell us about what Mindanao voters wanted?
Yes, Aim. Thank you again also, everyone, for inviting me today. And I'm very honored to be here. I went to Mindanao at the very day, 2 days before the elections, for two purposes: to cast my vote, and number two, it was Mother's Day, the Sunday before. So hitting two birds in one stone. So there are three things that I observed in this the election. So first, that I realized that understanding the local dynamics is important in our inquiry or in our understanding the national events, political events of the country. And one key observation is about the vote buying and vote selling. I observed that there's more of a vote selling than not vote buying, to the extent that I can observe how some locals would sell their votes, like would go to the what we call a purok leader, the village leader, to insist, please include my name, so that in the day of the distribution they will get. So we call it the local language alindahaw or ulan-ulan, or like raining of money. So it's more of a vote. My sense really is, while vote buying is very rampant in what we see in media or in the scholarships, I can also sense that vote selling is also an interesting case, how the locals are very interested to sell their votes to get the money in that day. And also, I also observed that when we ask them about the concept of conscience, like, don't you feel bad when you receive money coming from a candidate like that and so? Then the answer is, the guilt is there when we will not vote because the person will receive the money, because we feel like obligated to vote in return to the money that we receive, especially that the money that we receive is the one that we bought rice for today. So like, conscience is not about a national obligation, but as a response to the favor that they receive and enjoy for that very day. And also, third observation is the role of the purok leader, the village leader, that to the extent that social media outlets and at the same time, some local influencer, one is Telma, making a joke, making a video about how the role of the village leader play in the distribution, a very local and central and localized way of this vote buying, vote selling that's happening in the local. And lastly, the police intervention, even if it's happening in the daylight, in my observation, I did not see any police that going to the villages, confronting people where they're vote buying or vote selling. That's just for now. Thank you, Amy.
Well, I'm definitely going to come back to the money raining from the sky comment there. That's fascinating. We'll move on to Rado, who's a leader of the overseas Filipino communities here based in the Philippines, but also you're heading up a support group for the BBM and the Sara Duterte camp. So can you tell us a little bit about why you and your network support Marcos and Sara Duterte?
Yes, so hello and good evening, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So first and foremost, we support BBM primarily because, of course, his vice president is Sara Duterte. So we really want the continuity. Majority of my fellow supporters wanted the continuity of the leadership of the of course, our former President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. And we all know undeniably that President Rodrigo Duterte is very, very popular. And until now, we can see the trust rating that is very, very high. So the very reason as well that many Filipinos, not only here in Australia and not only in the Philippines, but globally, why we voted for Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was because many people, many Filipinos have realized that after we expelled Marcos Sr. in 1986, the succeeding president from former President Corazon Aquino to Benigno Aquino III, they have failed the Filipino people with the promises of what we fought during EDSA People Power, the democracy. We believe that it became even worse, worse than the leadership of Marcos Sr. So that's the very reason why we supported, why we are rebelling against the former leaders in our Philippines. That's the very reason. Thank you.
Oh, that's a fascinating viewpoint. So just to quickly add on to that, so are you saying that you're starting to see the resurrection of democracy in the Philippines when Rodrigo Duterte came to power?
Of course, democracy has been there even during the time of from Corazon Aquino. But what I'm trying to say is that the Filipino people have now realized that real democracy is actually the eradication of corruption and poverty. And from Corazon Aquino onwards, the poverty and corruption have been in existence. So what we're saying, you're right, probably Filipinos have been awakened to the real sense of democracy, and that is the power of the people to really voice out what we really believe. And what we believe is that during the period of Corazon Aquino onwards, they failed us, and we want a true democracy that is built on economy, that we want to have a progressive life as compared to the period of Marcos Sr. Versus the succeeding presidents.
That's an excellent segue into Sandra, who's an expert on the Philippines economy. Given that economy always is one of the most important things people probably voted for. So what can you tell us about the state of the country's macroeconomic performance, historically up until now, and whether or not it some of it helps to explain the BBM Duterte victory? I know you have some slides to share with us, so please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Aim, and hello everyone who's joined us online. So as Aim mentioned, my focus in this panel is mainly on the economic performance of the Philippines. And so what struck me, just building on what Aries and Prime and Rado have pointed out, in the lead up to this election, there was a lot of chatter on social media. Aries and Prime have both highlighted the role of social media in this election. So there was a lot of chatter on social media about the desire for voters to bring back the golden age of the Marcos Senior presidency. So as Rado has mentioned, it was really a desire to go back to pre-Corazon Aquino times when things were presumably better. So I wanted to then go back to the data and investigate the claim of this golden age of the Philippine economy. And this is what I found. So looking at GDP growth or economic growth of the Philippines versus the ASEAN region. So that's the first measure. And the second measure is capital formation. So which should be an indicator of the perceived riskiness that investors see in the Philippines on the assumption that if the if the economy is viewed as less risky, then you'd have much more investment into the country, both domestic as well as foreign capital formation, which should then spur economic growth in the country. So this is what I found. So looking at 2, 4, 6, 7 presidents from Marcos Sr. all the way to Duterte, these the orange line in the middle is the Philippine economy growth rate during the respective president's term, and the blue line is the ASEAN the regional economic growth in ASEAN within the same period, and the gray line is capital formation growth in the Philippines. So as I mentioned earlier, this is an indicator of how much investment flowed into the country during each president's term. So looking at Marcos Sr., this was the martial law period. We see that the economic growth in the Philippines was slower at 3% compared to the ASEAN region, and capital formation was also pretty low at 1%. And then capital formation increased during the time of Corazon Aquino, dipped a little bit during the Ramos presidency, and then was at an all-time low during the time of Estrada, where capital formation actually contracted in that period, and then picked up again during the term of Macapagal Arroyo, Benigno Aquino, and then dropped significantly again during the time of Duterte. So the conclusion, and you can all read the details, I've put up a QR code that takes you to the piece that I wrote for the East Asia Forum that'll give you more detail. But my conclusion in my personal quest for where the golden age of the Philippines was over the from 1965 all the way to 2020, the golden age of the Philippines wasn't the Marcos Sr. Period, but was actually the Benigno Aquino period, where the Philippine economy grew faster than the ASEAN region as a whole. And capital formation and investor confidence was at one of the highest in recent history. So those are my findings in tracking the Philippine macroeconomic performance from 1965 to 2020.
That's fantastic, and I encourage everyone to check out her recently published piece on the East Asia Forum. But I thought I'll pick on you a little bit there because your data looks great. Now, when you're talking to people on the ground, is it entirely possible that there's a lag effect of an economic growth, which meant that if the growth was happening during Benigno Aquino, that you're not knowing, right? That you're not actually feeling it until Duterte on the ground. I mean, the data says one thing, asking people on the street is one other thing.
Well, there's definitely a lag in that a president is always going to kind of inherit the previous economic performance of the immediately preceding president. So there is a bit of a lag, but then if we take the entire 6-year period, which is typically the term president, then we can see the trajectory of growth. And if any of the people in this webinar have any specific questions about each of the presidents, I do have data that shows the trajectory of growth for each of the presidents during their respective term. That's a great question, Aim. Absolutely, there is a lag.
Thanks, Sandra. So I'll just move on to some of the group questions, and then we'll get back to you. Is the slide still there or it has stopped? Okay, thanks. So one of the, the worldwide reaction to the victory, and actually an overwhelming victory of Marcos Jr. was that, on the one hand, the supporters hooray, basically this is what democracy is, the people have spoken. On the other hand, some observers have argued that Marcos and his supporters wanted to rewrite history, to reshape Marcos' legacies. What's your take on that? We'll start with Aries.
Well, the term now that media has coined is that the 2022 elections were responsible for the restoration of the Marcoses politically. But I do think that that remains an unfinished project because the Marcoses, and I pluralize because I do think that what separates them is that they're a cohesive dynastic unit. And I suspect that governance from the Philippines will not be primarily be through just Bongbong Marcos himself, but through the family at large, because that is their brand of politics. We've seen this during the martial law period. But I do think in terms of changing history and changing the way they have been perceived and the way other politicians have been perceived, I think this is part of the restoration. You can't simply restore your dynasty in power. It is not mutually exclusive to somehow also casting doubt to some historical pieces of consensus and in the country. And this has been a project that has happened way before the 2022 campaign. And this has given, in fact, a lot of power to the Marcos Jr. campaign, because prevailing studies of political scientists trying to look at disinformation or at least narratives during the election campaign in 2022 show that the most powerful is the one that Sandra just presented contrary evidence against. And this is that the golden age of the country was during the martial law period. This was the strongest, this was the most motivating narrative for people to cast their vote to Marcos Jr. So I think that will not end, not because the Marcoses have won, that these attempts to change history and change historical facts will stop, simply because the project is not yet finished. Reaching the pinnacle of power, I think, is just the start.
Prime, I know you're eager to jump in there.
Okay.
Yep.
Yes. It's very interesting. Part of my thesis now talks about the collective memory, and I'm asking the question of who creates or who determines memory. And sometimes some scholars would say that the powerful one or the vectors are the one who creates history or memory. And also in one of my classes, I remembered one of my teacher talking about epistemology and ontology, where she defines between the truth with big T and truth with small t. So she asked us, how big is your T? Which connects us to our question of, are we actually rewriting history, or are we just digging more data to make the T of truth bigger and bigger? So to what extent are we able to, so for me, in conclusion for that question is that I think as long as we are able to gather data, correct data to support our claims that will create bigger or smaller the T that we claim, the truth that we claim, I think there is no problem with revisiting the history that we have, as long as it will drive us to the bigger T that we want to pursue. Thank you.
So what's the truth, Rado?
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah, so I from my end, I believe personally that as far as having conversation with my fellow Duterte and BBM supporters, I believe that we are not, Marcos, or we are not rewriting history, but we have this so-called historical realization. That's the concept I would like to portray, that many Filipinos now have been reawakened to this sense of history. Of course, there should be no historical revisionism, but somehow, to some extent, history can be also collectively biased in the sense that every person has his own personal narratives and personal experience. I just want to give a highlight that even my own uncle was a victim of martial law. Even during my younger days, I was a member of the College Editors Guild of the Philippines. I value this sense of democracy. Now, this so-called historical rewriting for the purposes of making Bongbong Marcos as the ideal new leader of the Philippines is somehow a matter of how we call it's a matter of a justification based on what we experience, first as a person, then second as a community, and third as a nation. Many of my fellow supporters here in Australia, they were born during the martial law period, and yet they support Bongbong Marcos. Many of my friends who support Bongbong Marcos also supported Corazon Aquino. So this is a fascinating thing. If we are trying to say that we are rewriting history, why not ask the people who are supporting Bongbong Marcos? Let's ask them this question: why do they support Bongbong Marcos? Is it because we or they want to rewrite the history, or they want the legacy of Marcos back, or have we realized something because after Marcos Sr., the Philippines have failed?
Sandra, anything else to add on this question?
I'm not a history scholar, a political scholar, so I'm going to sit this one out for now, Aim. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks for, I think what Ari said was great, because basically, you're producing data to try to sort of, we can always learn more with just looking comparatively. And I want to get back to, Rado's really good point about listening to supporters of different sides to understand motivations better. Because I think if you're observing, like me, I'm not from the Philippines, if you're observing the election from afar and you're listening to the global coverage of the election results, and documentaries from Four Corners or what have you, it seems to be painting this picture that the supporters of BBM and Sara somehow duped by disinformation or something, and lack the agency to be able to decide who to vote for. Is that a fair statement?
Actually, thank you for that point. Actually, that was actually the main flaw or problem of the political party of Robredo. They tried to put in the minds of the people that BBM or BBM-Sara supporters were a bit naive of historical facts, that we are ignorant, that we are stupid. So I think that was the main problem why actually BBM won. Because the fact that we do not respect the narratives of other people, the fact that we disregard and disrespect the views of other people, it would even violate this dictum of democratic respect. The reason why I'm telling this is because many of the Filipinos who support Bongbong Marcos and Sara Duterte, they're actually intelligent enough to decide which is right and which is wrong. However, the views that we see in media that we rewrite history, that we are disinformed, it would be very unfair, because the people that I have interviewed with, some of them were actually born during the Marcos period. If the Marcos period was really so bad, why are they supporting Marcos now? And some of the people, some of the friends that I have interviewed as well, they supported Corazon Aquino. They were part of those people who joined EDSA People Power One, and yet now here we are supporting Bongbong Marcos. This must be a wake-up call for all academicians, for all the Filipino people to move, to think outside the box. What I'm trying to advocate is this: we have to listen to all narratives and not just one narrative. And this would be the cause of the democratic problem if we will only insist on what we believe and disregard what other people believe.
I wanted to get back to a point that I heard Aries mention in some of his many media interviews about the fact that actually the Duterte and the Marcos camp were not in line with, were not together in the, and in fact the union isn't as strong at all as some people might think. So what do you think do you think that the supporters of Marcos and Duterte are actually quite different and that they just came together as conveniently for this election, and what does that mean going forward? Aries?
Oh, is it just okay? Okay. Yeah. While this alliance have been struck, I think, or formed way before 2022. In 2016, while they both ran in different tickets, then Mayor Duterte and back then Senator Marcos Jr. already had some informal cooperation. In fact, the Marcos dynasty was only one of the very few local dynasties back then in 2016 that supported the candidacy of Rodrigo Duterte. A lot of the other dynasties were supporting the incumbent administration, the Liberal Party as well. So while this alliance has been existent, there was some tension in the beginning before the official end of the campaigning when Sara Duterte was still in the running for the presidency. In fact, Sara Duterte's numbers were higher than Marcos Jr. I can distinctly remember a September poll that put Sara Duterte as the top candidate. And we can see this perhaps with the reaction of President Duterte himself over the alliance and over the way that it turned out that Marcos Jr. Became the presidential candidate, and with Sara Duterte accepting being vice presidential candidate, even if she was polling way ahead of Marcos Jr. and the rest. However, the elections had shown that independent of one another, both the Marcoses and the Dutertes won't be able to accomplish a lot politically. So I still think that this alliance serves its purpose, meaning they both complement one another. We've seen that with the electoral results. The classic formula of Marcos Jr. saying that it took the unity of the North and the South was basically what the Marcos-Sara Duterte alliance did. And we've seen this with the election results. Mindanao itself delivered for Marcos Jr. when Marcos Jr. himself was considered to be not as strong in terms of support from Mindanao, and vice versa. Sara Duterte, on the other hand, benefited from the bailiwick of the Marcoses in the North. However, it's one thing to unite in Philippine history, as we have seen. Dynastic alliances or even political alliances are often written in water because there are no institutions that would deliver the credible commitment of a stronger alliance. So I do think that it's one thing to win the elections, but it's another thing governing. It's a totally different ballgame. And as we have seen in the cabinet of President Marcos Jr. so far, we've seen a relative lack of people coming from the Duterte administration, particularly the main cabinet portfolio. So we'll have to see how this alliance will turn out, because if they remain intact, this might be the most formidable political force that the Philippines will have in the coming years and in the coming decades. But if not, then this alliance will then just be temporary, just like a lot of things in Philippine politics.
Thank you, Aries. So the final question I have before I open up the floor is just regarding something Aries just mentioned just now, was that during the campaign period, and you could totally disagree with me on this, Rado, it seemed like the Marcos was very light on policy as a driving force for campaign. So what can we expect in terms of the administration now taking over? Do we expect basically policy continuity from the predecessor? Any thoughts on that, anyone?
You want me to speak on this, Dr. Eng? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for that question. So actually, I have to agree with you. It's a bit, his policy is lighter compared to President Rodrigo Duterte, but he just started. It's just more than a month. Let's give him let's give a benefit of the doubt on how he could lead our country, because BBM is different from President Rodrigo Duterte. BBM is even different from his father. Let's see what version of a leader BBM Marcos is. But I still believe having Sara Duterte as his vice president and his secretary of education, I believe Sara Duterte would be a catalyst of making sure that the continuity of her father would prosper. I hope so. But let's just wait and see.
Okay, great. So I'm going to turn to the questions posted in the Q&A, and please feel free to either raise your hand or write some questions there. I'll first ask a question relating to your slides, Sandra. So Mel asked about, the golden age slide. If you could explain why there is a convergence with the dip of ASEAN local capital investment during Duterte. It seems there's a relationship between the three streams of investment at the country level with what's going on at the ASEAN and global level. Is it really about trust and perception?
Thanks, Aim, and thanks, Mel. That's a great question. So looking to this slide, it's important for us to also point out the context, and you're absolutely right, Mel, the context within which this economic performance occurred. So I'd like to point out the term of Estrada. So Estrada was the Asian financial crisis president of the Philippines, and that kind of explains why the ASEAN economic growth and the Philippine economic growth are kind of converge at this point, because there was just general lack of investor confidence during the time of the crash, the Asian financial crisis crash. And among the 7 presidents on the screen, Duterte is the COVID president. So that also partly explains why the ASEAN economic performance and the Philippine economic performance kind of converge at this point, along with a dip in investor confidence. So that explains that partly explains why. So the regional context explains why the numbers look like that. Thanks for the question.
Excellent, thanks, Sandra. So the other question from Jovino, is it democracy that withdrew or liberal democracy that withdrew? I think that was in relation to your comment, Rado, that previous presidents before Duterte failed the EDSA people. So is it about the death of democracy or just liberal democracy that wasn't working?
Yeah, I would say it's not a death of democracy, but a realization of what democracy is. Because even with me, I supported President Corazon Aquino. I admire her so much, especially with our value of democracy, of human rights. But what happened, especially even for me, I grew up there. I was expecting so much that one day after Marcos Sr., then we have President Cory Aquino and all the other presidents. We were hoping that the Philippines would be better economically and everything. there will be less corruption. But this view of democracy, yes, we are free, and yet many people were still poor, or even worse. So I think the question of democracy is also a question of what democracy really is on the level of those people, of the masses, because we believe this value of democracy, it failed us because many people are the gap between the rich and the poor were still big during the Corazon Aquino time onwards.
Is that what you saw as well, Prime? Like you were saying that in Mindanao, there were more people trying to sell their vote for money than people buying votes. So are you observing, entrenched economic inequality there? Is that what's driving some of the support for the BBM-Sara Duterte camp?
Somehow, to some extent, AIM, and I would like to have a caveat that is only based on my observation in the place that I came from. So it makes me to question, like, what is the perception? How do the locals connect themselves to the government? And so, like, do they really care if what's happening in the government, or do they actually care because after all they were marginalized and they were only being remembered when their vote is important to the politicians? So like that. And so, like, the question of how do they really feel in terms of having a government manning them, and also connect to the, and also with that, I forgot what I was going to say. I would like to say that as far as the policy is concerned, as what you've asked a while ago, that the BBM has the light policy campaign. We have this saying in the Visayan context, like that, kung ang saad makaburos, daghan na naburos. Like, if the campaign promise can make you pregnant, then you're already pregnant for many times. So there is a very negative image. As far as the local is concerned, maybe they will go to the campaign because there will be snacks to be provided, like that and so on. But and they are used to it, like that. Oh, the politician will now promise again and promise again. So I think, as far as my conversation with the local is concerned, the promise are good, but they don't really believe that the promise will give them in a reality after the election. So, like, if BBM give promise or not, then for me it doesn't matter at all, because what matters is that if in the next 6 years he will be able to pursue great projects and make a difference, and I think that would matter, because again, the image of promises is very negative as far as my conversation is concerned at the local.
Can I
Yes,
quickly
yes.
add? Yeah. Well, this idea that democracy is being undermined but at the same time that this is a validation of how strong Philippine democracy is, we must qualify that the kind of democracy that has existed, and regardless of time in the Philippines, is the same. That's why when you say the more things change, the more they remain the same. Philippine politics continue to be dynastic and elite-oriented from the get-go. If you look, President Marcos Jr. is the third offspring of a former president to ever become president. I think we have the most number of presidential children to become presidents. And if Sara Duterte will win in 2028, if we still have that constitution intact, she will be the fourth. So what I'm saying is the Filipino people seem to be trapped in some warped political world wherein they will have just to choose between dynasties as their representatives of whether or not their lives and Philippine democracy will change. And this is because Philippine democracy has never been anchored beyond political dynasties, beyond political families. Instead of being anchored with institutions, instead of being anchored with political parties that have different programmatic visions for the country, we're being asked to choose between which political dynasty will serve us this time. So I think really the emancipation of the Filipino people, for me, does not simply rest with one dynasty over another, with the infighting of these political families. Politics in the Philippines need to be reimagined, because if not, then we're trapped in this world.
So, Ari, so are you saying that, in fact, Filipinos could have chosen Leni Robredo, right? And break the pattern?
There have been many attempts to break the dynastic pattern. And this is where it's a function of the political system itself, giving, for me, as a political scientist, undue advantage to a lot of political dynasties in terms of their ability to win elections, in terms of the way that they have mastered the political game, and their refusal to implement major electoral and political reforms that would level the playing field, that would enable many bright, young, and smart people who don't have political pedigree to be able to offer themselves as alternatives to the Filipino electorate.
Okay, great. Okay, we're starting to have a lot more questions now. Rado, can you confidently deny the use of trolls by the Marcos campaign?
I mean, I can only judge based on what I see and based on what I hear. But as far as I am concerned, there are actually no trolls. I mean, there are many allegations that even in my own public posting that there are trolls that are trying to invade my posting, but I don't see them as trolls. Some of them are legitimate. So I believe trolls are just in the imagination of some people, because now when we see people commenting negatively, many of us would just set it aside and say, oh, they are just trolls. But whether they are trolls or not, I mean, even from the BBM or supporters or not, I mean, we have to listen to all the narratives. This has been my advocacy. Whether we disagree or not, let's just listen. Whether they are trolls or not, if they have some points that they have some points that they're trying to raise, let's just listen. But I believe trolls or not, of course, we have to listen. At the same time, we need to be respectful and careful.
Okay, so in your view, there are no trolls, just people with different opinions.
Yes, I think so. As far as I'm concerned, because I have seen so many people saying that they are being invaded by many trolls. But how can we really prove that they are trolls? That is the first question. I mean, even one person can now create different accounts, but does that mean they are trolls? I mean, we have to think philosophically, how do we define trolls?
Any response to that? I mean, there's an active line of research in the Philippines that looks at, the political economy of campaigning, right? And the use of PR companies that as part of, campaign to write positively or spread certain messages for certain candidates. Any thoughts? If not, I'm going to move on to the next question. There's a number of anonymous questions, but there's two from Rain, so I'll just get to your questions first. So you argued that actually BBM actually spelled out his policies in interviews in Carambola and Maestro regarding improving support for agriculture and to achieve food sufficiency and better distribution of produce. Lowering cost of energy. So in fact, he does have some, offering of policies. They may not have been mentioned as rigorously as previous candidates that you've mentioned. Any thoughts on that? Or Rain's other question, whether or not the Philippine elections would just be a celebrity contest until the government system is changed into a parliamentary system. Is that the kind of point you're getting at, Aries? That unless there's some significant change, the political system, it's just going to be the revolving door of whose children from which political dynasties are going to win next time?
Yes, but unfortunately, the parliamentary shift is not one of them because there have been no studies, empirical studies, rigorous studies that are based on comparative evidence that has shown that parliamentary systems are way better than presidential systems in general. So it's not the system itself, but how the system actually works. So for example, regardless of whether we are presidential or parliamentary, if you don't have an anti-dynasty provision in place, which we have, it's in the Constitution. But Congress itself, which is housed by dynasties, has refused to pass a law. That law has been deprived of the Filipino people for 36 years because it's in the Constitution that dynasties are banned, but we still don't have a law. So in any case, without those changes in campaign financing, the evidence has shown that Marcos Jr. has overspent in terms of electoral spending way beyond his opponents. So that tells us what? That you need money in order to win elections. And those who only have access to these resources will be allowed to be able to run for the presidency. So if we don't have these, we would call them little reforms, not big changes in the system, then the system will reproduce the same type of politics. And finally, I think one major reform is we need to develop our political party system. If you have presidents that could just invent parties, presidential candidates, and if you have politicians who keep changing parties as if they're changing clothes, and we all know in every mature democracy in the world, the moment you change your party, that's almost like political suicide. Because no one will trust you anymore because you keep changing your loyalties. But in the Philippines, it has become the national pastime of politicians to change one party to the other and invoking that line that my loyalty to my party ends when my loyalty to my country begins. That for me is pure rhetoric. It doesn't really explain to us why politicians change parties. And the answer is clear. Political interest.
Great. Okay.
I might also return
yes.
to the
ahead.
previous question, Aim, on policy. So I think it's great that that Marcos Jr. has articulated some policy direction over the next few years of his term. I do want to point out, though, that from the economic data and just looking at the post-COVID world that we're standing at the threshold of, I'm going to say that COVID has actually thrown a spanner in the works, not just for the Philippines, but for all other countries in the world. And the challenge in this post-COVID world is for governments to actually rethink very, very seriously economic policy and really think seriously about the way forward. So among the 10 ASEAN countries, the Philippine economy experienced the second largest economic contraction among the ASEAN 10. The biggest economic contraction happened in Myanmar, and the Philippines was just next to that. So in other words, the Philippine economy is pretty much decimated at the moment. So what does that mean for the country and its leaders moving forward? So first, it does put into question how much or how relevant policy continuity might be from the previous administration, because clearly the playing field has changed. The global economic field has changed, and what policies may have been good or successful in previous administrations may not actually work at this point in the global economic history of the world. So it's a big. The future has a lot of uncertainties because COVID has changed the face of the world, and the Philippine economy has really suffered significantly throughout this pandemic.
Thanks, Sandra, for further clarifications of the COVID impact on the economic performance. I think, so I asked one last question, contentious question, which is, Why is the Marcos family continually denying, avoiding the charges against them despite the overwhelming evidence? This cannot be a case of what you call collective bias, as even foreign observers and agencies have noted these factors. I guess, Rado, you're first up on this one, and then the rest of the
Yeah,
panel.
all right. So, but first and foremost, of course, I do not speak on behalf of Bongbong Marcos or the Marcos family. Okay, their sentiments could be different from my own sentiments, but I believe with the allegations that they are denying all the allegations against them, I cannot speak about that. But I believe, even though you would think I'm a supporter of Marcos in general or Duterte, what I would like to point out is this: is stick to the facts. Now, if there is a martial law, if there are victims of martial law, yes, then we have to accept. But if we are trying to point on Bongbong Marcos as the same Bongbong Marcos Sr., that's a different story. The sins of the father, of course, is not the sin of the son. I mean, we should give a benefit of the doubt of who Marcos Jr. is, whether he is part of those kind of allegation. It's not for me to answer that. But let's just remember, there is a rule of law, rule of court in the Philippines. If these people of I'm talking about anti-Marcos people, if they have this conviction saying that this Marcos family have done this and that, then they have to go to the court. Let the court decide. It's not for me to decide whether Bongbong Marcos Jr. is a sinner. We have the rule of law that we should respect, and that's democracy.
Okay, we have one, thanks, Rado. We have one final question from the audience. Jovino, would you like to speak, please? Hello? Okay, oh, sorry, the audience can't speak. Could you type up your questions and maybe we'll get to it. Okay, last question then for from Ahmad. You asked, I have a question about how does the power of civil society and media in the country make balance of Marcos Jr. administration? Marcos Jr. got almost 60% of voters. Okay, so this is a great question. So this is the majority. It's going to be a majority in power, a majority government. So how could how could it be a balance between civil society and the media in the country? Is it out of balance right now? Can anyone speak to this issue? As the final question.
Aim, can I quickly?
Yes.
I won't take much of the time. In a sense, media has been very much on the defensive. There's been heightened media repression since during the Duterte administration. We know that the biggest media company has been refused of its franchise. Nobel Peace Laureate Maria Ressa has been convicted, and it's now, I think, the case is being appealed in the Supreme Court for something that she did prior to the enactment of the law that she apparently has violated. So all of these measures tend to have undermined the space that is being given to media and civil society. And there's no doubt that Philippine civil society is in a much more weakened position. And a lot of this has something to do with what the previous administration has done. But I do think that it would be erroneous for the Filipino people to just equate democracy with the May 2022 elections, despite the 59 to 60% electoral mandate, because democracy itself is not just about a majority mandate. While this is the essence of a democracy, democracy is also about, as what Rado has mentioned, the rule of law. It's not, we did not elect an absolute ruler in May 2022 to be able to do whatever he or his family wants, right? We elected leaders who occupy public office, which we define as a public trust. So therefore, it is up to institutions, both inside and outside of the Philippine government, to make sure that this mandate of the Filipino people is oriented towards the respect for the law, for accountability, and so that governance is well maintained. If not, then the mechanisms of our legal and political system should be activated. And part of that is the ability to dissent. What I have observed is that people, many, have construed criticism almost as undermining government. There is a universe of difference between pointing out the things that government needs to do or failed to do and ousting a government. Those are two different things. So this inability to discern between criticism that could lead to better policies to somehow this paranoia that there will always be attempts to unseat government is one thing that has polarized the entire country. So in the end, I think civil society, media, we might not want what they are saying. We might not hear and listen to what they're saying too. We might invalidate it, but they have a role to play. Media was not constructed to just put praises to the government in power. You look at all the well-developed democracies, media don't praise governments. They're the fourth estate. They're supposed to be the fiscalizer on behalf of society, civil society as well. So I think in the end, Philippine democracy cannot just be equated with an electoral mandate. It coexists with principles of restraint, constraint of power, and rule of law. And Philippine democracy in the coming years will be tested on its ability to balance this, because if not, then it will just be the tyranny of the 60%.
Well, thanks, Aries, for your final comments on that, which I think wrapped up nicely our roundtable on the Philippines 2022 election. Thank you, Sandra, Aries, Rado, and Prime, and the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, and for everyone here who had joined us today, and for many of you who had actually put in the questions. So thank you and have a good evening.